Right. I'm going to get this right now. All right. So we have Alex Love on the program. Alex runs a consulting firm that works with employers to build inclusive workspaces, culture in a variety of industries. As the founder and CEO of Alex Love Consulting, Alex leads a network of human resources consultants, trainers, facilitators, strategists, and project managers to provide guidance to organizations about HR and DEI best practices. They work in partnership with the clients to create inclusive workplace cultures through climate assessments and policy analysis. Strategic recommendations and the implementation of actionable plans for sustainability and accountability. Alex is currently a collaborator at Level Set, an organization that provides custom support to clients committed to hiring people who were formerly incarcerated. Level Set advises employers about changing policies and developing pilot programs specifically for greater inclusion and support of employees that have been justice impacted. So, welcome to the show, Alex.
Yeah. Hi, thank you. Welcome for having me.
So anyways, thank you for, and this actually leads perfectly into our first question, which is like, why did you create this consulting firm? What is
Yeah,
about that made you pursue this work?
of course. Yeah, I think that's the great first question. I think the honest answer is honestly, the first kind of idea of being a consultant came from seeing someone else be a consultant. I think that, when we're growing up in grade school, it's not like you can be a teacher, you can be a firefighter or a consultant. We don't really kind of talk about that as an opportunity. And I was working as a HR person at some level, and I heard of like a consultant that was working, and someone was actually like talking about it negatively, but I was like, oh, what do they do? I could do that. And that was really like the impetus, is like, oh, I think that I could be a consultant and help other people kind of along the journey with the things that I know a little bit about. But honestly, there was another part that was just, I was burnt out from being a full time HR person, and dealing with all that comes with that. There's a lot of work and lots of time under appreciated role. So I was ready to kind of go out on my own. But in addition to that, I really wanted to try and make a larger impact than I felt that I could do being at like one employer or kind of one place. Whereas, being a consultant and having multiple clients, I get to kind of see into a bunch of different workplaces instead of just advocating for one. I can talk a little bit more about, best practices across workplaces, and rally employers in that way. So I love it because it has a greater impact.
Fantastic. So we'll go into it. Let's talk
Yeah.
about it. What are the some of the things that you rally behind when you're doing this work?
Yeah, definitely. So I think in general, talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, I'm always trying to get specifically leaders to just think more thoughtfully about that employee life cycle. And when I say employee life cycle, I mean everything that touches the employee when they are employed. So from the first moment of seeing a job posting to being hired to what is that performance evaluation or review, all the way to like what's learning and development, and making sure that throughout all of these processes, folks feel like they are included, that they have been thought of, that they have an opportunity to speak, that they have access to resources. And I think I spend a lot of time talking to employers around, what are you saying out in the world in terms of our organization is X? Because a lot of times we have like those brand values, those organizational values, but do those values actually mimic or is that what you're feeling as an employee of that organization? The company, Apple company, said that they did X, Y, and Z in terms of they had a value of honesty, for example, and I meant like Apple the fruit, not the real company. Bad example. I was like, oh, let's not use that one. But I just meant like company X. If you had a value of honesty and transparency, what does that actually mean for employees that are at your organization? When they're there, do they feel that? Is it reflected in your performance reviews? Is it reflected in pay? So being really mindful of whether or not what you're saying actually matches what people are feeling and experiencing when they're working at your organization.
Can I follow up on that? Like, how do
Go
you
ahead. Yeah,
determine
go ahead.
then that's real? Is that through interviews? Is that through observations? Like, how do you start to do that assessment work so you can help make sure that that is
Yeah, that's
matched?
a that's a great question. I think that honestly, before I'm even engaged in the work, there's a lot of conversations with the leaders, right? In terms of what are your goals? What are we trying to do? And to be honest, kind of in those initial conversations, what I'm trying to assess in terms of whether or not we even want to engage in the work is whether or not the leaders are bought in. And when I say bought in, I mean like really bought in and invested, and are willing to one be open to their culture and their structure shifting, but also the investment that it's going to take to really shift some of these processes, structures, policies. Because very honestly, a lot of my recommendations aren't cheap. Like my recommendations are like, I really want you to shift all of your onboarding or shift all of your learning and development, or sometimes my recommendation is you should lift your salary floor. And those aren't small things, those also aren't cheap things. So really making sure that the leadership is really invested in wanting to move forward, and not just yes, we want to be more inclusive of people, but really really mean that and really understand what that means, and also what the impact of that will be on the employees, and also whatever the mission of the organization is, or whatever product or service they're selling. If you have an understanding that DEI is going to help and impact all of those pieces, those are the type of leaders I want to talk to.
So I'm curious. So let's say somebody put in, like you said,
Hmm.
honesty is one of our values of our company.
Yeah.
And then you do this research and you say, actually, I don't know if that's true.
Hmm.
Like, I don't know if that's actually a part of the values. So, kind of going back to Brendan's sport, like when you identify that,
Hmm.
how do you bring that information to the leadership? And
Yeah.
then how do you rectify that?
Hmm. So I think one piece, and I think I didn't fully answer your question, Brendan, but in addition to like those conversations with leadership, we're also doing like an employee survey of everyone. We're doing
Mm,
focus groups with folks. We're doing interviews with leaders and different people in the organization, maybe ERG leaders, depending on how big the organization is. So we do kind of a climate analysis or assessment of kind of all of those processes, get a real sense of what are folks feeling, and then going back to leadership and saying, these are our recommendations, this is what we think that you should change. And so if you have a value of honesty and I'm talking to all your employees and they're telling me that's not the case, my recommendation would go back and be like, let's change the values. One, let's change the values. Let's be real about what's actually going on. But then
mm,
two, how do
interesting.
we instill the values that we do want? One, why aren't people feeling like there isn't honesty? Like, let's address that. But then two, let's be real about what our values actually are and whether or not they're connected to whatever it is what we're doing. And so really working through that and kind of unpacking, like my question to folks would be like, where did we come up with this honesty as a value? Did it make sense? Did we pull it from a cloud? Like, why do we have this? What is its purpose? Because I think sometimes we're talking about organizational values, and you're like, what does that really mean? So if transparency is your value, how does that manifest in the real working of being there as an employee? So kind of asking a lot of those questions. I think there's a lot of times where I ask leaders, just tell me more about what's happening here. Okay, maybe we could think about it in this different way. Um, so I think a lot of times getting to the root of why things are the way that they are, and like, does it make sense?
Yeah, so I was just gonna follow up on that because it's
Yeah.
interesting. We've talked about this before about as employees, how do you advocate for
Hmm.
those change in policies or whatever it may be,
Yeah.
and so you're so once you've yeah, do employees tell you, "Hey, I want this. I want honesty to be a part of this culture. I want these things to be added on." And then, like you say, you give these recommendations
Hmm.
and then move forward with it. I'm just interested in like the process of this occurring.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one thing is a lot of times the answers that folks are looking for are already there. A lot of
Mm,
times you have employees that are saying, I want this and I want this, and it would be so much better if we had these things. And a lot of times leaders aren't listening, and they would instead rather hire a third party to listen to their employees, instead of kind of understanding that you can do that as well. Obviously, not everyone is an expert, but I think there's a lot of times where you need to listen as a leader to what folks are saying, because a lot of times they already know the direction that you should kind of go in. So I think that that's one, is just like, are folks actively listening to what has been said? And then two, I think when there are kind of organizations or environments where folks don't feel maybe as comfortable sharing whatever it is, a lot of times knowing one, my background in HR, but knowing that our process is confidential and that whatever they're sharing with us is staying kind of in our purview, and that we are only using that information to help and kind of be the voice of those employees. So it's kind of like, tell me what your stories are so then I can go back to leadership and like figure out how we're making this work better. So it's really great because I do, from the beginning, get a lot of trust from employees, not all the time, but it's really great because then, with all of that input, we can really make the shift that everybody wants to see.
It's like you get to be this you're the third party other that kind of walks into the room, so you can have this idea that maybe you don't have the same tensions because of the relationships that already exist. It's great, you get to kind of
Hmm.
disrupt that way.
Yeah.
Thinking just about a lot of the conversations that have been going on, both because of the pandemic, also I think because of the unrest that we saw with like George Floyd around these issues. We
Hmm.
saw this whole pattern from a lot of companies and corporations either putting out statements or trying to change policies and these things. And so what has maybe been trends that you've seen that have been effective, or that you really that stand out to you as being something that you would like to see more of moving forward?
Yeah, I think, I appreciate you bringing up uh, George Floyd being murdered last year, and really how that was, so impactful to a lot of movements. I think what's challenging is we continue to have kind of moments in the media, where certain things are being highlighted and folks feel inspired to move and to change and do things, which is great. Love for folks to be inspired, but really would love to see more engagement around that inspiration. I think that unfortunately it is very fleeting. And so a lot of times, when there are moments in the media and things happen and there's now a national conversation, unfortunately it's fleeting. And there might be folks that engage in talking more about creating anti racist organizations, but whether or not they really follow through with that, whether or not that makes it past 2 months, it's a different conversation. And I think that I definitely see that kind of shift with the ways in which folks reach out, because there's definitely peaks when things are in the news and they're like, I just heard about things, and you're like, I'm probably not the person for you if you just heard about racism. I'm not start somewhere else. I'm not the
This is a
one.
thing.
Right. And so I think that's part of the challenge is, there is just so much lip service, and a lot
Mm,
of commitments and pledges, and we're going to do the thing, and now we have, employee resource groups for people of color and for Black people, and that's great, but have you done a compensation review? Are folks getting paid equitably? When was the
mm,
last time you looked at your hiring processes and thought through whether or not they're inclusive, whether or not you're thinking through job descriptions and skill sets and education requirements, and really thinking through, are those necessary requirements? Can we be flexible? Can we be thinking about different types of candidates, for example? I think just all sorts of things that I get fired up around in terms of like, engagement in the real work, and really shifting things so that people feel psychologically safer at work, and that they're actually, being hired for a job that makes sense for them and they have the right skill set for, but then they're also getting paid equitably and fairly. And then on top of that, do they have opportunities for growth? Is there learning and development? I think that there's just kind of so many levels to the engagement in this work. And I don't say any of that to kind of uh, make it feel overwhelming, only that there's just a lot of talk and a lot less action. And so that's what I'm always trying to encourage.
So, what are the blind spots that you see from a vast majority of corporations or organizations that you work with? Like, what is like the number one thing that you see being overlooked?
Yeah, I think I think what a common trend is that a lot of times organizations are not having conversations around some of these things that are happening in our day-to-day lives as humans. So for example, there's no conversation about racism, there's no conversation about classism or ageism. Some of
Mm.
these things, there's no spaces for it. And what's, I think, challenging is when you've never had a space for it and folks don't feel like this is the place to speak about some of these things, then what do? And then you start training, and now you've kind of started having these conversations, but then don't necessarily have the structures in place to actually support folks. So sometimes you have, a DEI training or any type of training. Now we're having conversations about race. But again, talking earlier about like the real work of, are your hiring processes inclusive? Are your onboarding processes inclusive? So then you start talking about these things, employees start asking for things, and leaders aren't ready to engage fully, like I said before, in that investment of really making sure that diversity, equity, inclusion is part of your culture, part of your fabric, and that we're continuing to learn and that we don't always have the answers. And sometimes we're going to have, challenging conversations, but that's okay because we would rather be talking about it than not talking about it. Um, so yeah.
What's a big challenge that you face in this space for your trainings? Like, what is something that people misunderstand about equity and inclusion within the workspace?
Yeah, I think specifically thinking about training, what can be challenging is that people get really uncomfortable with their own feelings and what they kind of discover about themselves, especially when they've never had to think about themselves or their background or how they've engaged with race, regardless of what their identity is. And just using race as one example, I think that having to think through how people will react and how to kind of make sure that there are spaces for them to feel comfortable having these conversations. Um, I think that a lot of times we have leaders that, I lost my train of thought.
No worries.
I was going, and I lost it.
Yeah, you were on the train. Don't
Can you
worry.
ask me the question again?
Sure. It's just like when it's you're always going to be pushback. People,
Yes.
people will say, "I'm not racist. I'm inclusive. Like
Yeah.
I'm not classist. I'm all these things aren't for me. I don't need this training." But I'm just wondering, how do you get over that mindset, and what
Mhm.
are the challenges that you face when you are pushing against this overall structures?
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for the question again. Yeah, I think what I was going to say is like in terms of our training, one of the things that is a challenge is just that people are at all different types of kind of understanding and awareness as it
Hmm.
comes to some of these topics. So we do a lot of kind of defining of terms and concepts. But not only giving the definition, giving a lot of historical context as well. I think that that's really a gap is folks believing that they know the history of something because we
Yeah.
grew, we went to history class in high school or whatever, and I think a lot of folks haven't like revisited or thought through those things. And so there are many times when we're going through the historical context and people are just learning brand new things and having to now think through that. And so part of the challenge is knowing that it's okay to kind of stumble when you're learning. And that really the goal is that we are all learning so that we can continue to support each other and think through these things and continue to have conversations that are challenging. Um, I think to the question around like what is challenging for us to kind of hold these trainings is how people become uncomfortable and then not knowing what to do with that. Sometimes they will attack the process instead of kind of sitting with their own feelings of what has come up for them. They're like, oh, well, the training shouldn't have been this way, or we shouldn't have started with this. And then you're like, no, it just hurts. It's just not great. And we're going to sit with that, and that's going to be okay because it's not great for a lot of people, and so that's why we're going to talk about it.
I think at some point we want to transition into the fair chance hiring program. But I think before
Yeah.
we do, I'm just curious, like, there's a lot of resources out there for people to kind of start this process, and hopefully
Mhm.
over the last year they've had ample opportunity to do so. But is there
Yes.
anything in particular that you find that you really like, you use a lot either in your trainings or you recommend to others that you just think is a really valuable resource for this work?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. There are tons of resources. So the first thing I will say is please diversify where you're getting resources from. Like, don't just get it from one place. Continue to just pull, and anytime someone's recommending a book or anything like that, um, definitely make sure to check out different places. And I think also different mediums. So like documentaries and articles and books and talking to people in real life. One of the docu series that I think is really really great for folks wanting kind of an introduction to some history. I will say it's intense, but it's great. It's called Exterminate All the Brutes. And it's a docu
Hmm.
series. I believe that you can find it on HBO,
Hmm.
but it's 4 parts, and it's fantastic. It's fantastic. So, but the one thing that I usually say is don't try to watch them all back to back.
Mm.
Just
Give some
watch
space.
one,
You need a
take a
break.
breath. Yeah,
Yeah.
because it's heavy, but it's so well done. And yeah, recommend both of you watch it.
Well,
Okay,
that's
thank you.
good.
Yeah,
I will sure watch that. We do have HBO Max, so
there you
there you
go.
go.
Awesome.
But yeah, I think. But Brendan said it. I think we want to transition into the Fair
Yeah,
Chance Hiring Program. We mentioned in the beginning.
of
What is
course.
the program, and just kind of explain it from there.
Yeah, definitely. So just to give a little bit of history, when I was running HR at Vice, I designed an apprenticeship program specifically for people who were formerly incarcerated. And with that program, we partnered with the Center for Employment Opportunities, which is the largest nonprofit in the country that specifically works on reentry work. And I think what um, what we focus on with Level Set is kind of replicating a lot of what I did at Vice in terms of one, really looking at what are the policies and practices of that specific employer as it relates to hiring, but specifically background checks, and thinking about what is that process, how are you being inclusive and supportive of folks, and there's a lot of compliance as it relates to fair chance hiring in terms of ban the box legislation, which is in several states and cities where you can't have the box on the application where you disclose convictions or where the employer asks about convictions. And so almost taking that many steps further and working with employers to look at the application process, but also look at their company culture as well as their local community partners, and seeing how we can, one, shift policies to be more inclusive, but also have like creating relationships with community partners and employers to kind of build that talent pipeline. And what's so great about helping employers really connect with a lot of their local community partners is a lot of these community partners provide wraparound services, which means, when folks are returning home or re-entering the community and their families, a lot of times there's just additional levels of support. Like maybe their housing is unstable, or maybe they need some more connections to job services, for example, right? Those types of things. And so it's really wonderful because there are also community partners that provide a lot of job readiness. So, taking folks that maybe need a refresher on going back into the workplace, or maybe they've never worked before, and kind of going through that readiness before they join an employer. And so our engagements with folks really range depending on kind of where they are in that process. But I think at the end of the day, it dovetails my other work, where in general, just trying to make more inclusive workplaces for folks, and really trying to change thinking around, who do we have at our workplaces, and are we supporting them to the best of our ability.
Well, and does that factor into this other project as well? Do you work with employers to encourage them to make spaces and opportunities for folks like this, and in that sense as well, like provide training or support in case they have questions and these things?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I feel like the process really mirrors the general DEI engagements that I do, in terms of kind of going through those practices and policies, really having an understanding, and then kind of giving them recommendations in terms of, okay, our goal is to hire people that have been justice involved. Let's change your background check policy. Let's change your performance review. Let's upgrade your onboarding so that people really feel included and a part of, the culture at this organization. And then separately, let's also partner with these community partners, to make sure that you're continuously getting candidates from this population.
And how have organizations and businesses taken this? Like how how is it being implemented? Like once you get it, do you feel like it's effective once you have these interventions?
Yeah, I think that it's quite effective. That we really dig in and try to be really mindful of what that company culture is and what their perspective
Mm,
is, right? Because I think that's the only way that you can really shift things, is if you have a good understanding of like, what is our starting place, and then eventually where are we going, but kind
right.
of customizing our engagements so that we have an understanding of kind of like where we're starting, where are those gaps, so that we can create kind of the most successful pilot programs. And then in both kind of veins of my work, we're not trying to stay, definitely just trying to be a helping hand along the way and give them those tools, because I don't want folks to be reliant on me. That's not the point of the engagements. The point is, let me help you get to a place where you don't need me anymore. Let's think about some tools. Let's think about structures, and then also adding to that culture the cadence of, for example, the fair chance work. If I'm recommending folks that you should probably review this every 2 years, a lot of times people don't review their policies for a decade, and then you wonder why it hasn't changed and isn't more inclusive. Things, as we know, move really really quickly, and so making sure that we're setting up those types of processes so that when we do leave, we know that they're continuing. And the last piece I'll say is just like, obviously with these engagements, we kind of get into the weeds and the nitty gritty of these employers and kind of see all of the behind the scenes. So a lot of times we're staying on for some type of a check in, and just making sure things are still going smoothly, and if there's any kind of additional support that they'd need, especially as folks kind of change and shift on their journeys.
Yeah, that's great. I was going to ask what mechanisms you have to follow up, but I think you've already answered that question. That is really seeing the like broader outline and timeline, I think, is
Mm,
so important for corporations and organizations and businesses or whoever. They just need to understand that this is a lengthy process, and
mhm,
it seems like you really delve into to help them get that.
mhm.
So, yeah. Um, we like to provide our guests a space to tell us about themselves, tell us where to find them if somebody wants to access their services. Please,
Yeah.
the floor is yours to say what you will.
Okay, thank you. Well, first, I just want to say, like, thank you to anyone and everyone that listened to me rattle on about DEI. But if you'd like to follow up on more hearing about DEI, I'm at alexloveconsulting.com. That's probably the best place. I am also on Twitter, but use it sparingly. So I mean, I could give the handle, but there's no updates there. But then you can also find me at Alex Love Consulting on Instagram. Um, so
Gr-
yeah.
Great. Yeah. No, thank you so much for
Mhm.
coming on. This has been fascinating.
Thank you for having me.
Before you go, I'm gonna throw you. You can also, you can pass on this, but I'd just be curious: is there any company that you've looked at, worked with, or just know whose policies you would recommend as a model if people are like curious to figure out what it could look like, and kind of a great example of that?
Yeah, I probably have a couple examples. What I will say is like the ideal, amazing version of hiring. I don't know if either of you have heard of Greyston Bakery. So
No.
Grayson Bakery, and I'm gonna just do a little advert for Grayson because they're awesome.
Yeah,
Grayson Bakery
cool.
is in Yonkers, I believe. Apologies for the plane. And they have what's called an open hiring model, and the open hiring model is basically where anyone from the community can go to Grayson and put their name down on a list. Um, and the only question is whether or not you are authorized to work in the US.
Mm,
And what happens is once they have an opening, they will call you and then you join their however long apprenticeship program. And then once you go through the training program, you have a job. And
Mm.
so there's not all of those barriers that we're so used to in terms of the drug screening and the background check and the credit check and all of these different things. It's really based on, would you like to work? Great, we're going to train you on the thing. And I will just say, I love Grayson Bakery for kind of all of the intentions that they have. One of the other things that they do is they have their regular HR department, but then they also have a person that focuses specifically on social services. And so when there are folks who have, for example, you're having a legal issue in court, let's say child support, for example, they will connect you with legal resources and things like that. And so those are kind of some additional resources that I feel like most employers probably won't kind of institute. But in my mind, what Grayson's doing in terms of that open hiring model is just like the ideal version to me of what employment really looks like. Like, yeah, let's just give people jobs and help them do the job well. Like, I don't know.
yeah.
I'm an
And of course, you
idealist
should
over
model to
here.
boot. Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean,
No,
no.
it's a simple one and one equation. You
Um,
want to work, just like help
Here's the
people
job.
work. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and we'll show you how to
right.
do
Yeah.
it. Yeah. Well, that's awesome. So
Of
thank you
course.
for that, and that's something we can go look up as well. And if anyone's in Yonkers, go get something to eat, y'all.
Yeah.
There's a place for you.
Yeah.
So yeah. Well, thank
Awesome.
you.
Thank you.